Welcome to Free Speech Nation, the podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. I'm delighted to have as my guest this week Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, is a women's rights campaigner, free speech advocate, and the author of many books, including this one, Bookprey, Immigration, Islam and the Erosion of Women's Rights, which is available for pre-order right now. Ayaan, thank you so much for joining me.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight to see you in person.
It is indeed, because we've only met over the internet, of course, through your podcast.
My podcast, and yes, virtually, and it's just wonderful to see you in person.
Well, I thought we should start by just giving some background to people who aren't familiar with you and your work. And you've been twice an immigrant because you grew up in Somalia and Nairobi, then went to the Netherlands, and then to America. So you are an immigrant success story. And yet people describe you sometimes as being anti-immigration. Perhaps you could give your side of this and explain where you've come from and why.
So I've been an immigrant many times over. I left Somalia when I was very little with my parents. We moved to Saudi Arabia. That's quite the immigration story. And in Saudi Arabia, as immigrants from Somalia, we had a terrible experience, as do many immigrants from all over the world who go to Saudi Arabia. And we moved from there, or rather we were deported.
Right.
And went to Ethiopia, and that was yet a different experience. Went to Kenya, another experience. That's where I learned to speak English. And then I went to the Netherlands and asked for asylum. So coming from the third world to the first world, this was in 1992. That was really quite, different.
And am I right in thinking you went to the Netherlands to avoid a forced marriage, or was that part of your reason?
It's not part of the reason. That was the main reason.
Right.
I was already forced into the marriage, but I saw this opportunity. The man I was forced to marry lived in Canada, so I was supposed to join him in Canada, travel through Germany. My relatives in Germany would have helped me with the immigration process to get into Canada as a legal immigrant.
Yes.
But instead of going to Canada, I took that opportunity to go to the Netherlands and ask for asylum. And that was then my own immigration story as opposed to what my parents and my clan desired for me.
Yes.
And I made a success of that. I say that with humility. I know how incredibly difficult it is. But it was a success also because of how I thought the Dutch were very welcoming and generous. And I know that a lot of people think what I just said is odd. But my experience was that they were very, very welcoming. They were welcoming to me. And
also, you became a member of the Dutch Parliament, and you went into politics. I mean, this is, as I say, a success story in so many ways.
Well, the people that I came into contact with in the Netherlands, and we hit it off. It was love at first sight, and I thrived there. And 10 years into my tenure, my residence, I had actually become a citizen. Some of the leaders in the social democratic side of politics said, well, can you please help us give the same sort of experience to everyone else who's been here for a generation or longer? And so that's how I made my way into politics in trying to answer that question. It's been so wonderful for me. How can I possibly help with that process?
I mean, I get that sense from your book as well, is that, so much of the work that you do is in fact pro-immigration, because you would like to see immigrants flourish in their host countries, and you're concerned about the ways in which that isn't happening. But we'll get onto that in a bit, because it's so important to what you've written. In terms then of relocating to America, now, obviously, this followed the horrific murder of Theo van Gogh. Perhaps you could tell some people, because I'm sure not everyone is fully aware of what happened there. Perhaps I should leave it to you to explain.
So, November the 2nd in 2004, Theo van Gogh, who worked with me on a film called Submission, was murdered in Amsterdam. Tuesday morning, early in the morning, he was on his way to work. And a man, originally, I would say his heritage is from Morocco. I'm not quite sure whether he was actually born in the Netherlands, but he definitely grew up in the Netherlands. And he became radicalized. That's the word that's used now, but he became very devoted to his faith, Islam. And his takeaway was that for the sin of blasphemy, you have to face the ultimate punishment, death, and that he was going to carry it out himself. And that happened on the 2nd of November 2004. And it was absolutely horrific, I have to say, for Theo's son, family, for me, for the wider community. Theo van Gogh had a lot of fans. He also had a lot of enemies, but he had a lot of fans in the Netherlands. He just was really the individual who kept this concept of freedom of speech, the right to offend.
Yes.
He's the one who kept it going. Every time some complacency came over the country, he'd be the one to find some group to offend, some individual to offend, some cause to offend. And when his life was brought to an end the way it was, for many people in Holland it was, but why? And there was someone who was asking the question, well, these people came from countries where they don't have freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience. They're here now, we're giving them all of these things. Why do they think it's right to kill people for what they think? And I think that really is the key question.
Yes, it's a question of cultural differences and how we address those differences. And we first do so by acknowledging them, I suppose. And of course, in the wake of that, you were subject to threats yourself, and eventually that precipitated your move to America. Is that the
well,
best way
I think
to put it?
the threats then from individuals who identified as Muslim and who actually wanted to follow the letter of the Quran and the Sharia law to, in such great detail, their anger and the fact that they were offended and that they wanted to hurt me shocked me, but it didn't surprise me. It shouldn't surprise anyone, because obviously as a devoted radical Muslim, that's what's expected of you.
Yes.
What shocked me, and ultimately I would say what drove me out of the Netherlands, was the preparedness for a large number of people to accommodate that, to say, well, in that case, you, Ayaan, and Theo van Gogh, and the others who are asking these questions, you are provoking this minority. You're driving them to murderous rage. So maybe it's better if you just get out of the way. And so ultimately, when it became very clear to me that the political elite, academic elite, media elite, had sort of reached this consensus, and the Netherlands is a consensus country, it was easier for me to say, in that case, I don't think I can serve anymore. And I don't want to be self-serving. And so maybe it's best if I just make my exit. And I agreed with some of the people at the top levels of government at that point that that was the healthiest way to do things.
Why does that keep happening? Because I keep seeing this again and again with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, for instance, where with the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses controversy, and again when these things happen, and we see these threats and often acts of violence from obviously a very small group of Islamist extremists, people in the media and politicians continually say, well, perhaps you shouldn't be offensive to a religion, and that it keeps happening. Yeah. Whereas, of course, if you believe in that foundational principle of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, that includes the freedom to offend and critique. Why is it that European governments across the continent are failing to uphold that principle?
So we're talking, with my experience, we're talking about 2003, 2004, 2005. That's quite a bit of time in between. And I think back then, in all of these conversations, over lunch, over dinner, in meeting rooms, in boardrooms, what are the trade-offs? I think the people, the voices who were saying, give the minority time.
Yes.
And over time, they're going to adapt. Our values are going to prevail. These values of the freedom of speech, association, conscience, you name it, these values are timeless. And it's just that the Moroccan community, the Muslim community from Turkey, the Muslim community from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, just give them time. Okay, it happened for you, Ayaan, but you have your foot on the accelerator in a way that's unhealthy. These social changes take time. That was the argument.
I see.
And so now, reflecting a decade and a half later, it's to say, so how far are we with that argument? Yes. Because that's been implemented. Are things better?
But that's my point, is that I don't think things are changing.
And I think now is a time to go back, and this is why it's so wonderful to have these conversations, to go back to exactly those same voices in the Dutch leadership, but also in the French, the British, the German, everywhere in Europe, and to say, well, it's a decade and a half later.
Yes.
And actually, it looks like the problem is only worse for a number of reasons. But it is worse, and I don't want to say, oh, I was right. I still think the factor time is very important. You should give people time to adjust and adapt. But that's not all. You also have to be very explicit about what exactly it is that you want them to adapt to. And I think that European leaders have failed in that.
Well, that brings us on very well to your new book, Pray, because this offers a very specific example of what you're talking about, of the European government's failure to address an issue, to brush it under the carpet in a way. And it's a very brave book because and very rigorously researched. I highly recommend it because to anyone watching, because I think it's an important issue that people do feel uncomfortable, and understandably so. I understand why people feel uncomfortable talking about this. And you say in the book, only by clarifying what has gone wrong in Europe in recent years can one make a truly credible case for effective integration of immigrants. So you're not making an anti-immigrant argument in this book. It's quite the reverse.
It's quite the reverse. And if we carry on that thread with freedom of speech, when we were having these discussions, arguments, exchanges, and sometimes quarrels, the argument was, okay, so now give freedom of speech time. You don't have to provoke them. You don't have to. If people are provoked by an expression of speech in a painting, in a documentary, in a movie, just let's not do it. It's not worth it. The cartoons, I don't know how old you are when all this cartoon stuff was happening. And so I felt that my back was against a wall when it was just speech versus people so offended and enraged that they were willing to take the life of someone else. Yes. And so in that sense, actually, the people who are saying, oh, come on, let it be, I felt that I didn't know what else to bring in there.
Yeah.
But sometimes we would talk about, but what about the rights of women? And there were women within those communities, Muslim communities, whose rights were compromised. They were forced into a marriage. Their genitals were cut. They were kidnapped from the country and taken to the country of origin. And all sorts of terrible things were done to them. And when we had those conversations, it went suddenly from a life and death matter, because these girls were being subjected to honor killings, or the threat of honor killings, to it's a minority thing, let's give it. And that time thing kept coming. And at some point, behind closed doors, people would say to me, things would be different if the same thing or similar things, the compromising of the rights of women, would happen to all women, especially to these native white women who had fought for this stuff and won these fights. And when I look at the subject of Pray, that's exactly what's happening. Women are being attacked in the open.
So that's the difference now, is that?
That is the difference. And so you can't wish this thing away. You can't sweep it under the carpet. You can't just keep saying, oh, time, come save me.
People have attempted to sweep it under the carpet, though.
It's relentless, the attempts to sweep it under the carpet. But it's not going, if anything, it's getting worse.
So if we take one of the examples that you give, which is an example that most people will be familiar with, is Cologne, New Year's Eve in 2015. Yes. Yeah. And this is predominantly Muslim gangs, groups. They were gangs. They were in literally groups attacking women. And the police covered it up, were forced to admit that there had been a cover-up. When that occurred, they had said that it had been, I think they used the phrase, largely peaceful event.
So I think, to be fair to the police, because I talked to a lot of people in law enforcement, the police did not want to cover anything up. The police and the leaders within the police that I spoke to were saying, we don't want to cover anything up. We just want to do our jobs.
Yes.
But it's their bosses in politics who say, stop, don't follow on this, don't call it this, don't, and
Yes.
you just get law enforcement with its hands tied behind
That's
their backs.
a very fair distinction to make, because I note that the police chief officer was dismissed at that time, but it wasn't really just. I completely accept that point. So it's come from the authorities, but in addition, it's also the media, and also, I mean, some of the victims of the attacks were called racist for pointing out that the people looked North African or Moroccan, which is what you do when you're attacked. You describe the perpetrator.
So within media, there is this sort of code of conduct that's being pushed down the throats of reporters and journalists who are saying, wait a second, I thought my job was simply to report what's happening. And they get, again, senior leadership who are in contact with politicians who are saying, wait a second, yes, you've got to report what's happening, but there are a few details that you need to leave out.
Right.
Because if you leave these details out, then you give, again, the process of integration time, but if you actually report on these details, you will end up empowering the wrong people, and the wrong people are far right, extreme right, skinheads, genocide-seeking white people who at any given moment will erupt into violence. So in order to preserve social cohesion, journalists, reporters, the police, social workers, all of these professionals are told this is the only way that we can address this issue. But then the more you reflect on that, the more you just get back to let's sweep everything under the carpet.
This is such a key point about your book, is that a lot of this is well-intentioned. And that makes it really hard to deal with. I mean, to give another example was the event, the Swedish police admitted to a cover-up in the wake of the Cologne event. This at a summer festival, and you write about these mass sexual assaults, mostly Afghan and Moroccan asylum seekers. The police hid the information that there had been 38 sexual offences on girls as young as 14. And when they were asked about why they covered it up, and they did admit to this, when they asked about it, they said they didn't want to provoke racism or to play into the hands of the Swedish Democrats, the right-wing populist party. So it's almost as though the public cannot be trusted with the truth, right? Which, as I say, is a well-intentioned thing. But could you maybe talk through why you think that is so misguided?
Well, I can share with you what I observe, which I sometimes think these people who come up with these schemes, they live on a different planet from the public. The public, as you know, age of pandemic, we've just been having all these to's and fro's about which country to go on vacation, which not, and when and how.
Yes.
The public in Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, they know precisely what goes on in countries like Turkey, Morocco, Egypt. They go to Muslim countries to vacation all the time. And if you're a female and you're white and you're from Northern Europe, you know exactly what you can and can't do and why.
Yes.
You know that there are cultural differences. You are told you can't go there in your tank top and shorts. You've got to dress differently. And here are the places. And when men hit on you, this is how you ought to, etc., etc. So when you get large numbers of men from those countries, who come and ask for asylum and try to make their homes in Europe. And these men continue to behave on European ground exactly the way that they were behaving back home. You, who live on the elite planet, you think you can now tell the public, oh, and by the way, we're going to try and keep this very open secret.
Yes.
This very open secret that it's so open, it's on social media. It's everywhere. It's on Lonely. I'm old enough to be the one who used to use Lonely Planets and things like that. But this is a very open piece of information. And like I said, I don't want to explain it. I just want to share with you the observation. Why on earth does this come from?
Well,
who do they think the public are?
They think the public don't have access to the internet sometimes. I think just in the digital age, you can't necessarily control the narrative in the way that you think. I mean, it's
not just the digital. It was there before the digital age.
Yes.
There were women from the West who fell in love and married men from the Middle East and other Muslim countries. Women from the West who traveled out there. They report. There are novels. There are movies. The general public is informed about the cultural differences. It's not, oh my gosh, this is something that the elite top down is going to hide from them.
Let's talk about.
So that's just one of the things that I'm observing, and you might as well try to explain it as I may, but it's.
Well, I think one of the objections would be, that you are at risk of demonizing and saying that these cultures are particularly susceptible to misogyny and that kind of thing. You say in the book that growing up in Nairobi, in Mogadishu, you said that living in these countries involves, as a woman, shrinking from men, being on guard, avoiding drawing attention to oneself, and that this is a reality. Yes. So are you nervous, though, that people will accuse you of cultural stereotyping or demonizing a certain group of people?
No, I'm not afraid of that, because my relationship with the general public, individuals I meet of every station of life, is to say, oh my gosh, this is different. And there's a very commonsensical reaction to context.
Yes.
If you are in a certain part of London, you know how to behave, you know what to do, how to survive and how to thrive.
Yes.
And if you decide you're going to go to a different country where that is the way to live, the unwritten code as a woman is to shy away, to look away, not to provoke men, just sort of erase yourself.
Yes.
You also do that. So I don't have that. I don't have the problem of everything that comes out of my mouth, everything I do is going to empower the far right. I also have to admit, I don't think I've ever really met anyone from the far right.
Right.
And so I've never been in a context where, the far right, whoever they are strategizing. I need a lot of education on that.
Yes.
But there is a sense for me,
yes,
that it's a bit of a boogeyman. It's a bit of a... whatever, when it comes to the subjects of immigration, Islam, integration, women's rights, freedom of speech, if you take on, in my view, a commonsensical perspective, you're shut down, because anything that has to do with common sense is going to empower the far right. And I think maybe it's now time that we just explore. That's
really interesting, though, because you take such pains in the book to make the point that actually you're concerned about empowering the far right, and that you're not dismissing that argument. But at the same time, like you've just said, I don't know anyone from the far right either. They are a very small margin. I'm not saying they're not dangerous. Absolutely they are, but they're not many of them. And in that respect. But it's good that you address the concern, but how concerned ought we be?
Well, I do address it, and then I've spoken to many different people whom I really respect and who know very much about the history of Europe, the history of the United States, the history of the far right. And obviously we always go back to the 1920s and the 1930s, and what is it that led to the factors of the Second World War and segregation in the United States, these convictions that people had about race and they had about different groups of people, to the point that, the Holocaust was possible. So it's not a joke. Mm-hmm. But the question for me now is, we're now entering the 2020s. Are the 2020s different from the 1920s when it comes to the far right threat? Yes. Is it as palpable? Is it really that? Is this sword that's just hanging over your head? Mm-hmm. And there's no one I've met who says that is the case.
Okay.
It isn't. The 2020s, 100 years later from the 1920s, are very different.
Yes. So then, that is, as you say, the spectre that it often appears whenever you try to discuss these cultural differences that you're drawing attention to, this idea of empowering this group, which are probably very small but nonetheless dangerous and unpleasant. But it's not that controversial what you're saying about these cultural differences. They are recognised both within the cultures and without of the cultures. This isn't something that you've just concocted. No. And one of the criticisms that feminists often get is that they don't seem to care about this element. Do you think they're not aware of it, or they want to pretend that? Because you make the distinction, I think, in the book. You talk about how in some of these Muslim majority countries, women are treated as commodities, not just devalued. In fact, you make the very, very clear point that misogyny is everywhere. Yeah. You say that there's no country or culture or society without misogyny. You're not trying to say it's just a singularly North African, Middle Eastern thing, But what you're saying is built into the culture and built into the religion, there is this commodification of women.
So to be very black and white about it, misogyny in countries like where I come from, it's still in the law.
Okay.
Right? there are places in Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, all of it. Like, this is what the law requires a woman to do, and here are the constraints, and these are constraints that are not faced by men.
Yes.
And so misogyny is not just something you talk about; it's real.
Yes, because you talk about the Me Too movement hasn't crossed.
No, it hasn't
barriers.
crossed that. And so, but there is, the point I want to make is there is a difference between societies like British society, American society, where in fact all of these legal constraints, cultural constraints, they've been eliminated as much as possible. So if there is a man out there who thinks that women are nothing, well, that's there.
Yes.
But he's not getting backing from the law, from the constitution,
right.
from the bureaucracy and other existing institutions. Let's acknowledge that difference. Mm. And that is, I think, something that feminists have acquired and have gotten used to in the West. And I think they do make a mistake, Western feminists, in assuming that men, just because they come from somewhere else where that's not the case, they come here, it's all just going to rub off on them.
Right.
So there is that element of complacency.
Yes.
But there's also an element of who are we to tell we white people who are guilty of colonization, slavery, and all sorts of other terrible things, who are we to tell these men how to behave?
So it's a kind of cultural relativism going on here.
There's a cultural relativism that's going on with feminists, and I think a number of feminists, just because they're white,
yes.
they think that they are part and parcel and beneficiaries of white supremacy, mm-hmm. structural white. We'll get into that nonsense, but that's how they feel. Or what they express. And then there's, I think, a class element that we cannot overlook, that I noticed while I was doing the research for the book, that children, I'm thinking about the grooming gangs here,
yes.
little white girls from working class communities do not have the same, they can't take the same protections, cultural protections for granted mm-hmm. that the middle class girls take. And so feminism, as you read it in the papers, as you see it on television, as it manifests itself in social media, is not the kind of feminism that's protecting these working class groups, as
yes.
it was not protecting immigrant women within those minority communities. So I think the class factor is a very interesting one. It's a very big one too. I've been familiarized in the last few years with the phrase white trash.
Yes.
Trailer trash. Hillary Clinton spoke of buckets of deplorables.
Yes.
So I think that's something, that's a thing.
I think it's definitely there at the heart of what we call the woke movement, the critical social justice movement, which comes from predominantly middle-class activists or a middle-class mindset.
Right. Yeah.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the grooming gang scandal. I mean, if we look at the height of the Me Too scandal, where there were whole articles about powerful women who'd had a hand on the knee and that kind of thing, but there was a cover-up of these working class girls, and it's, I mean, Sarah Champion, the example you give in the book of the Labour MP who was asked to step down from the shadow cabinet for simply raising these issues. The feminist writer Julie Bindel attempting to get her work published on this and being turned away again and again by newspaper editors saying, no, you will be accused of racism or xenophobia. Now, how do we deal with that? Because there is a legitimate point here in that there are people out there who will attack people who are identifiably Muslim. They will vandalize mosques, this kind of thing. That kind of behavior is a thing. It does go on. Yeah. And so are we not right to be concerned about exacerbating that?
We are. We're also, and we should be concerned with being precise in our language. So I don't think there is a cover-up.
Okay.
Because a cover-up, I think, constitutes some kind of conspiracy getting together and saying,
yes.
well, here's how we want things to be.
I suppose a better phrase would be a lack of transparency around the truth, or a failure to report when it could have helped, I suppose.
Or cowardice.
Okay.
People are being cowardly. I also think that there is a sense of maybe guilt, shame, whatever you call it, towards immigrants and minorities. And,
yes.
And that, but also towards working class in the way they've been abandoned.
So again, all well-intentioned.
it's well-intentioned, but it is, in the end, what was the expression, the path to hell, the way to hell was paved with good intentions.
Yeah, yeah.
But the good intentions are cynical in the sense that they only seem to benefit those people who are virtue signaling. You've done a fantastic job in writing this yourself and marking it. The Titania McGrath book, I think, tells that story of, what is the point of saying I'm really over the moon about social justice when that really only reflects on how you feel about yourself.
Yes,
and that's
doesn't have a tangible effect.
It doesn't have a tangible effect.
Yeah.
You're not really sacrificing anything, and whatever it is that you virtue signal, it's something that makes you look good.
Yes, exactly.
Without changing and actually really victimizing the groups and the individuals who find themselves in bad spots because you're withholding resources. And the reason why I say you're withholding resources is you're not allowing the conversation to go to a place to improve the conditions of the poor people, the underprivileged people, the oppressed people, because it's all about you. And it's one reason why I'm incensed, angry, enraged by the woke. It's all about them.
Yes.
It's very narcissistic. I want us to talk about people who are in true poverty and get very quickly to the question, well, what is it that we can do about that? What are the required resources, the required time, the patience, the learning? But they'll never let you go there. It's all about just having to, put out your little banner and say, look at me, I care about these things.
Yes.
And then moving on to the next tweet, moving on to the next whatever it is that they complain about. It's really not about the causes.
I mean, it's all very well, isn't it, saying that you care about human rights and putting the Twitter bio and putting your posts out on Twitter to say that. But then when you see examples of women being abused and not actually doing it, and not just not doing anything about it, making excuses for the perpetrators. I mean, isn't that, and that to me is something that's very shocking, the way in which women's rights seems to be a casualty of the woke movement.
And cultural relativism and multiculturalism and this whole narrative of cosmopolitanism and globalization. Look, I benefited from globalization and cosmopolitanism, so I shouldn't be one to be talking. But I have to say to you, if you do have a conversation about, a young woman walks in and says, my goodness, this is what just happened to me. And you get a description of how she was terrorized by a group of young men, calling after her, following her, menacing her, groping her, surrounding her. And this story is not told by one young woman, but it's told by another and another and another. And you see there is a change happening in the village you are in, the town you are in, because a new group of people who have come in, they look different, they don't speak your language, and suddenly you go from being completely unaware of your gender to, oh my goodness, what is it that I am doing that is provoking this behavior? And over again, you're told you're not welcoming enough. You're displaying signs of xenophobia. You are racist. But again, you describe, I can't get out of my house without having to contend with this threatening behavior. And it has nothing to do with anything else other than that I'm female. What should I do?
Yes.
And I've recorded in the book authorities and voices, spokespeople for authorities who are saying, dress differently, wear different types of shoes, don't go out at night. So in other words, take the exact same precautions that I used to take when I was a young girl living in Somalia and in Kenya and in Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia, because women who live in that part of the world, they know no different. This is how we were raised. Avoid men where they go to. But when you're in Germany, in Sweden, in the UK, and the advice you're getting is don't provoke it.
So in other words, blame the victim. In other words, don't seek a way in which we can have discussions about integration and how we manage that. Yeah. Instead, adopt ideas that are normalized in the countries where you come from, and that. I mean, you've even got in Germany. You mention it in the book. it was the equivalent of a chastity belt. Someone invented safe shorts.
Yes.
And it was an anti-rape underwear.
Anti-rape underwear, anti-rape bracelets. I think there's a company in the Netherlands that says you have a bracelet that's supposed to emit in the same scent as that of a skunk.
Yes.
As if you think that's how to put these men off. But it's also very confusing to these young European women who are told, your body is sacred, bodily integrity. You are in every way just as powerful, if not powerful, than your male counterparts. You have to speak up for yourself. You can aspire to and dream about these positions of leadership. Oh, but wait a second.
Yes.
Actually, when I'm leaving my front door, suddenly I'm told my body is the problem.
Yes.
My scent is the problem. My attire is the problem. And so these young women have to deal with that confusion. That if they want to be welcoming citizens of Europe,
yes,
if they want to be anti-racist, if they want to be open-minded and brave enough to take on the world, then they should go out and do it. And they're encouraged to do so. And then the minute they're confronted with these unintended consequences, in my view, of immigration and globalization, then they're told, oh, come on, get off it.
So it's mixed messaging. And we have to be very clear about where you're coming from here, because you do it so beautifully in the book. And you're very clear that you're not interested in empowering the far right. In fact, you're nervous about that. You're not trying to stereotype any particular type of person or culture. What you're saying is that, and you're not saying that Muslim men are particularly violent or particularly prone to.
Not particularly.
You're saying that there is a cultural view of women which is deeply embedded into that culture, and when there is migration to a certain scale, it is inevitable that traces of those cultural attitudes, and as you show, the evidence is there. It's not something that you've just made up. It's
absolutely. And if all men, let's assume, have something in them towards women, which is, you're physically stronger. And so anywhere in the world, you will find men who want to exploit that physical strength to do things that are wrong and do wrong things to women. And sometimes they do it as individuals, sometimes they do it as groups.
Yes.
With many Muslim men, if they want to invoke their religion, it gives them an excuse. That excuse has been taken away from the Western man. It's been taken away if they wanted to invoke Christian excuses, Christian reasons for doing that. That's been taken away from them. If they want to do it Jewish reasons for doing that, that's been taken away from them. If they want to do it simply by saying, well, I just happen to be stronger than you are, that has been taken away from them, because the law is that if you do that, you will go to prison. So there truly is a cultural difference, and it's deep, and it's there, and it's real. There are the men who think from a cultural perspective, religious perspective, they can get away what other men can't get away with.
So the question then isn't necessarily about limiting migration. Is it more about the way that we educate people or create a scenario where people are integrated? That's
absolutely right. It's not really about, obviously up to a degree, it is about immigration, because numbers matter.
Right.
You have to select who do you let in and who do you leave out.
Yes.
So I don't want to say immigration is unimportant, but I think immigration is a topic on its own.
Yes.
And I try to touch on it in the book. But ultimately it is about integration. That's the term that's used in Europe. Assimilation is a term that's used in the United States.
Yes.
But it is to demand that, young men coming from places where misogyny is excused or even enshrined in law, when you come here, it's different. And you have to abide by the values of here, the laws, the norms. If you don't, there'll be consequences. And those consequences have to mean something because they're enforced. And that is, I think, where we are. That's where we need to take the conversation.
But if you are a cultural relativist, as so many of the critical social justice group are, then what they would say is what you're doing in that is you're saying that one culture is better than another, and it's a kind of supremacist idea. And they would say, therefore, that even the concept of integration or assimilation, whichever you want to call it, is in a sense a form of racism.
Well, as a woman, I'm saying exactly that. Yes, one culture is better than another. Some cultures are better than others. Some are superior. The culture that constrains the misogyny of men is better and superior to the culture that enshrines it in law and in its norms and in its customs or excuses it. I'm sitting here saying that, and it's not only a fact, but it's also on my side a wish. I wish, I dream, I hope, and I want to advance a campaign to get those men to become like these men.
Yes. And it takes quite a lot of courage to make that statement, though, because people
it doesn't take
angry.
any kind of courage. It just takes pure common sense and clarity of mind. I think here's where the feminists are failing their constituents, if in fact there is such a thing. It's to recognize the differences, what it really means to be a woman in a world where men are physically stronger. And if that physical strength is not somehow I go back again to constraints, but it's not to, take away men's freedoms.
Sure.
It's just
an acknowledgement of the
acknowledgement,
reality.
that there are actually men who will abuse that physical strength, but you have to put roadblocks on that. That culture is so much better. And what about homosexuals? The country I come from, various countries that I've lived in, it is. You'll be put to death. If not by the government, you'll be put to death by your own family and your extended family, and you're treated like a freak.
But this is what I find so confusing about the people who call themselves on the left and the people who claim to be about social justice. When they make the claims that they're making about cultural relativism and the importance of not imposing one value system onto another, they're effectively siding with the most reactionary elements of that culture, because they're not helping gay people within Islamic countries. They're not helping women. They're siding with the more powerful body. So that to me seems like a contradiction.
And they're not helping the poor, and they're not helping the deprived and the oppressed, because it's about themselves. That's what it keeps going back to. They want either to use the vulnerable positions of the people who are in trouble to gain power. So for them, it's only about power, or it's very narcissistic. It's very much about self-fulfillment and navel-gazing. It's, oh, look at me, I care about these things, but you don't care that anything happens. Because if you actually cared, you would allow the conversation to go to the place where it should. And that is the question, then what? What should we do? What are the steps that we need to take that will improve the positions of these people?
And those are the people I think that should read your book the most, but almost certainly won't. Insofar as, because what you've presented is the research is so rigorous and incontrovertible. It's been presented, you're thorough, and it's presented in an accessible way. And I wanted to mention a specific case to exemplify this cultural difference. And I don't want to imply that this is an anecdotal one-off thing, because you give so many examples. But it's the case of Hussein Kavari, who murdered Maria Ladenberger, who was a medical student, 19-year-old medical student. Now, he arrived in Germany, claimed to be a child from Afghanistan, was housed with a German family, and then he went to school as a minor. Then after he'd raped and drowned Maria Ladenberger, it was discovered he was in his 20s. He was probably from Iran. And I think the key thing about this case is his behaviour in court, is the fact that when he was asked about pushing a woman off a cliff, and you've quoted it in the book, his response was, "But that's just a woman."
Yeah.
Now, in his mind, it wasn't even immoral that he'd raped and killed this woman. It was, and you could say, well, that's just a one-off, but you give so many examples and so many statistics that there is something that within this cultural practice that believes it is actually a moral duty to be abusive to women. That's not a moral, that is a good.
When I was a child in Somalia, among my Somali relatives, and it goes on in the diaspora, when Somalis in Ethiopia, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, I used to hear that phrase all the time.
Which phrase in particular? Just that it's for you?
It's just a woman.
It's just a woman,
It's
right.
just a woman. Like, what's the big deal? It's just a woman. So it would be a sister or a cousin or a wife or a mother, a woman who would be expressing despair and pain. And it was always dismissed by some of the men in the room as, I don't understand what the whole big deal is, but it's just a woman. And to the husband who's complaining, oh, my wife is giving me a hard time, well, just take another wife. What are you on about? See, that I'm so used to that. And I remember this when I was in Kenya and exposed to different people from different cultures. It went on like this. The Kenyans, the Pakistanis in my class, men from Yemen, they were all absolutely didn't understand what the big deal was about. And that picture of that man confronted with German law, and he's being asked, and you can see his lawyer, but also the other members of the, they want him to express some form of remorse, guilt, regret. He doesn't have it. He doesn't understand them. He thinks they're mad. They think he's mad. That's a collision of values. It's a collision of worldviews. You've got to wake up to that.
Yes, because I mean, a number of the anecdotes you mentioned in the book really shocked me. I mean, you talk about the Egyptian lawyer in 2017 who said on television, when a girl dresses immodestly, it is a patriotic duty to sexually harass her and a national duty to rape her. And again, now he was prosecuted for that. But you're saying that there is this points to a broader trend and a broader attitude. But can you understand? I mean, I don't know any Muslims who would think this was anything other than abhorrent. Muslim people in this country, the people that we know who are Muslim in this country, that's an unrecognizable attitude.
The Muslim men I spoke to for the book in Sweden, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, when we have this conversation, these Muslim men who are protective of women, they're Muslim, they identify as Muslim, they're devoted, they're practicing Muslims, they are protective of women, they are ashamed of the behavior of other men who identify as Muslim and then use that as an excuse to treat women badly. These men say that they are dismissed as being westernized. So even within their own communities, a culture is thrown at them.
Right.
So a man who's kind and really, really good too, and when I mean good, I mean allows women to be as free as they possibly can be. He is told, but you've become too British or too French or too German. You're not one of us anymore.
So what is the extent of this problem? Because people will say to you, well, that Muslims in this country by and large would find this terrible behaviour. But you're saying it's more common than we would like to admit, I suppose.
Yeah, and I'm actually not having any problems talking to Muslims, whether they are men or women, about this problem and what to do about it. I'm having problem talking to white people who are in positions of leadership who, when they spoke to me for the book, said, well, please just don't put my name down.
Right.
I could be fired from my job.
So there's an acknowledgement within the Muslim community that this is a problem?
Yes, absolutely. Right. There is an acknowledgement within the Muslim community that there is such a thing as westernization or, say, becoming British or French or whatever. There's an acknowledgement that they're dealing with two different cultures. And even more explicitly, there's an acknowledgement where a lot of my Muslim acquaintances, friends are saying, that's why I left my country of origin to begin with. I came here, I was in search of this type of stability, freedom, equality. I was in pursuit of these values. And when I come here, I'm made to feel excluded by my own community because they're saying, you're not one of us, you're so weird, you're just becoming like them. And they are telling me, you're so weird, you're different, you're saying things that I can't see, you sound racist and far right.
Yes, and it strikes me, though, that there doesn't seem much of an appetite to, well, firstly, we've talked about acknowledging these issues, but seeing how they're actually making matters worse. I mean, another example that you mentioned is the case in Normandy of a Bangladeshi refugee who was given a suspended sentence for raping a 15-year-old girl, second offence. And then you quote the experts in court who make the point that, but he was influenced by his culture, and that's why he has this. That's why he's raping children because of that. So in other words, the cultural differences are often used as a defence as well. So they are acknowledged and yet not acknowledged.
Yeah, there is an infrastructure of defence lawyers and other experts who find all sorts of grey areas and loopholes within either the philosophy of law to get the defendant's out of trouble or minimize their sentences. But there's also a cynical group there who come in as experts and say, in the case of that young man, you couldn't possibly send this man to prison because given his context and his background, yes, that's the acknowledgement. They acknowledge we have a cultural problem here that has shaped this man to do what he has done, and he has no idea that what he has done is wrong. But then on the other side, those very same people, those very same voices are the ones to say all cultures are equal and you should make no references to culture
Exactly,
whatsoever.
that's what I mean. The contradiction there seems incredible. You're at once suggesting that someone is a product of their culture and has no agency. And on the same side, you're denying any kind of difference at all.
And I think we have got to out these people because they're in it only for themselves. It's not really that they're helping this young man because he's going to end up in prison. If he doesn't end up in prison for this particular crime, he's going to end up in prison for a different crime because he will keep on doing things thinking, I can get away with it.
I mean, I don't normally like to look into people's minds, but it does strike me so obviously cynical.
So cynical.
Because it's also not helping any future victims that will come out of... I mean, in that case, as you mentioned, I almost couldn't believe this when I read it. In that case, you said that a police officer had to stand between the defendant and his interpreter because in the court itself, he kept trying to grope her thighs.
Yeah.
So he's demonstrating the very behaviour he's being accused of in court.
In court, yeah.
So he clearly doesn't have any sense that this could be considered wrong.
No, when I was an interpreter, I translated for a man who kept saying to me in Somali, so I'm translating for him from Somali and then to the judges in Dutch.
Yes.
And there was a Dutch female member of the panel of, we don't have a jury system in the Netherlands, it's judges.
Right.
A female. And he kept on saying the worst things that you can say to me.
As in misogynistic?
In Somali,
things.
very misogynistic, just really terrible words. And I couldn't translate it because I was so embarrassed. I was literally melting with embarrassment. And the prosecutor said, you've got to translate every word that's said.
And did you?
I did. I had to. With shame looking down my eyes and saying, this is what he's calling the judge. And that's how open he was about it.
So that leads to another interesting point, is that is it the case, would you say, that for a proportion of migrants who have come from these cultures and are still steeped in that culture, that they have a disregard for Western police, Western authority? You make the argument in the book that because the punishments are so lenient, in North Africa, if you fall afoul of the police, you might be beaten and all sorts of...
Yes, there are different ways of there are deterrents that we don't want here in the civilized world, yes.
And that means that when they get even a suspended sentence, you describe that as effectively a green light to continue with bad behaviour.
Yes, absolutely. So I think one thing is to acknowledge these individuals and the fact that they're steeped in this stuff. And wake them up to the fact that, wait a second, you are now in a completely different place. And if you carry on, I mean, people having attitudes and beliefs, I'm a liberal, I think you can believe whatever you want. Whatever's between your ears is between your ears.
Yes.
And I have nothing to do with it. But the minute you take an attitude to behavior, now we're talking about something different. There has to be consequences. They have to be told, wait a second, something is going to happen here. And it's not going to be in your interest. And the thing that I think would make the most impression on this type of individual is to say, you are going to go back to your country of origin, and we are going to make it happen.
Right.
And this is not far right, it's not extreme right, it's not all of these labels. It is a way of conveying the message. This is the kind of deterrence that makes sense, not the deterrence that is in the country of origin. So if I know of my clan, and if I had behaved according to the code of my clan, as expected, but regardless of that, I'm attacked, my attacker is going to be murdered in a gruesome way. So I don't think we should be proposing that. I don't think we should be importing those types of punishments here.
So again, hold to our values in terms of the judicial system as well, and
absolutely. But but then you have to come up as a liberal society with a method of deterring crime that makes sense to the individuals who are about to or who are considering committing that crime. So a lot of these men don't think that attacking a woman constitutes a crime. They just don't think it.
Yeah, but that's the key, isn't it? How do we... Well, first it takes an acknowledgement, doesn't it, of well, you see, people would accuse it of cultural superiority, but couldn't we find a way that we all agree? We all agree, don't we?
But we agree that it is culturally superior, don't we?
Well, we agree that surely subjugating women, taking away women's rights is worse.
Yeah, I don't need a lot of... It is culturally superior.
But that's my point, is how do you phrase that in such a way that everyone
can agree? It is superior. It's just simply superior.
To promote women's rights rather than attack them?
To protect women's rights, yes. Yeah. Cultures that protect the rights of women are superior to cultures that don't.
And given that we can all agree on that?
Yeah, then you take it from there.
Then you take it from there. Then how do you then... I'm saying on a very practical...
Well, then you are coming, the young man who is about to abuse women, you're coming from a culture where you say, and that is what's happening in these court cases, the Bangladeshi guy is an example who says, I had no idea I was committing a crime.
Yes.
I thought everybody did that. So then you obviously have to enlighten this individual and say, wait a second, not only that, if you do it, you'll be on a one-way ticket back to Bangladesh.
But this is why I'm struggling, because I fail to see how anyone could disagree with that premise. Is that we asserting women's rights is strong.
How they can disagree with it, because then you get into the next level, which is the bureaucratic level, which is the amount of money it costs. So what kind of allocations are we willing to allocate to protecting the rights of women and their physical safety? Rounding these guys up when they do this, putting them on a one-way flight or whatever to places where they come from. We have an array of laws, existing laws. For instance, if the individual who has committed a gruesome rape, even murder, here is to face some kind of terrible punishment in the country of origin, not for that crime, but for something else, then we should not, Article 8 says we should not deport such a person. So it gets more complicated than just reaching the commonsensical conclusion, well, if you don't want to be here, you don't want to behave like us, then get out. I get that, and there are lots of difficult arguments to be had about what is an appropriate measure against people who break the law. But I think if we can all agree that we should apply the law equally, irrespective of who the individual is, then surely we'd be in a much stronger position to begin with. I think you're absolutely right. And then it is, once we have that agreement, how do we implement that?
So, which brings me on to another question, because so much of this discussion is fraught with accusations of Islamophobia. And as a term, I find it fairly useless, I have to be honest, because it seems to be applied to the kind of idiot who would tear off someone's hijab on the street and verbally abuse them. And it can similarly be applied to someone who just simply has a legitimate criticism of an aspect of the religion they don't like. Now, those two things are poles apart. One is a thug that we can all agree with, it's appalling behaviour, and the other is just someone raising a question in an open way.
If you pull someone's hijab, you're committing a type of assault and crime, and you're actually infringing on someone's space. And that individual has all sorts of, tools. Go to the police, get an affidavit, get this person to be dealt with.
And rightly so.
And absolutely rightly so. And I think everyone agrees with that. It's so appalling and so disgusting. Everyone agrees with that. And in the countries that we live in, there actually are consequences.
Yes.
You don't have to give it all sorts of wonderful labels like Islamophobia. It's a crime. If I come and start, tugging at your clothes. I was reading in the newspaper someone who tried to take a picture with Chris Whitty.
Yes. Yeah. The video that went viral.
So that's the equivalent of tugging at someone's headscarf or
so we have laws in place irrespective of identity or notions of protected characteristics or anything like that.
Yeah, and there are consequences. And also those people are then, just, they do need to learn where the boundaries lie.
So then,
like I said, you can have whatever it is that you want between your ears.
Yes.
If you believe that Muslims don't belong here, women should not be wearing headscarves, if that's what you want to believe, that's between your ears. But the minute you start acting on it, there are consequences, and that has to be uniform. That has to be. You have to deal with this person who's committing that kind of act of prejudice, but also the other one.
I'm totally with you on the liberal position insofar as I think people should be able to think whatever they want. It's how if they infringe on other people's rights.
Yes.
But what I'm struggling with is this neologism, this word Islamophobia, which we say, which we apply to those kind of people, but someone who attacks an identifiably Muslim woman on the street, and and commentators similarly use it to a feminist writer like Julie Bindel, who just doesn't want working class girls in the north to be raped.
Yeah.
That, you know, and I can't reconcile that.
Yeah. I think the Islamophobia term is a manufactured term. It is supposed to make us all feel like what you feel when you hear the word homophobia.
Right.
Or you hear the word Islamophobia. Sorry, you hear the word racism.
Yes.
It implies that there is a minority who are being persecuted for no other reason than the fact that they belong to that race or gender, in which case Islam is neither a race nor a gender. It's just a set of ideas.
It's a belief system, right?
It's a belief system. So if you're afraid of a belief system, then you're afraid of it, and there may be good reasons for that. There are very good reasons from recent experience to be afraid of some of the very radical tenets of Islam. So I wouldn't call that Islamophobia. It has nothing to do with phobia. It's actually a rational fear. If you think that someone who takes these things very seriously is going to blow you up or is going to engage in some kind of violence. So I think the Islamophobia word is manufactured. But again, it takes us back to this trying to make exceptions for exceptions and exemptions for minorities or certain groups of minorities, but not others.
Right.
You can claim to be a member of a Muslim community and say, I'm offended by, there's just a very long list of things that such people are offended by. And we'll say, we'll try and protect you from that. But then what about the other religious groups?
Yes. Well, I mean, there does seem to be a singular focus on Islam as in a protected group. I remember reading Charb, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, who was killed in the massacre, and he wrote about, he compared the idea of Islamophobia to the idea of communistophobia and the idea of being because what that phobic suffix does, it kind of pathologizes the idea as though, not only are you wrong to criticize this aspect of the religion, but you're mentally ill to do so. There's something wrong with you for doing it.
Yes, and it's not just, it pathologizes it, but also makes you a mean, crude, xenophobic, narrow-minded person. Who are you to be saying these things? And that's what nobody wants to be seen that way. So then people just think, I'm not going to engage in this debate. And so then you create an atmosphere of silence. You're punished. It's a cancel culture in its own right. And it was a cancel culture before the present-day cancel culture. But
how does it work? Because, I mean, to go back to what you said earlier about back in 2003, 2004, when you were told, well, they will change. If you just give them time, people will change and cultures will change. Well, for any ideology or idea about the world to reform, it has to be challenged. And so therefore, why would they be so afraid of doing it, if that's exactly what they want?
I was having those conversations with people like Timothy Gatton-Ash and Ian Buruma and just this whole cohort of people who had thought through, freedom of speech. There are people who lived with this notion for much longer than the people who are just coming in. So if they're just coming in, of course we are for freedom of speech. Of course, right? We get it. But give these people time. And if I were to say to Timothy Gatton-Ash and Ian Buruma, well, let's go back, let's sit down, let's talk about what have we achieved here. Yes.
What would they say now?
Well, I would put on the table the things that I was saying back then. You have this. First of all, if you accord it to this minority, then why would this minority not take it? All of the objections that people on my side were saying, they seem to be coming out. And also, if you say, and this is back in 2003-4, that particular minority was very much ready to use force to get what they wanted. And that bothered me the most.
Right.
It wasn't like they were coming to the table and saying, just give us time, because 20 years from now, we're going to think otherwise about things.
Yeah.
They were saying, if you draw a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, you will be beheaded.
And it was a minority, we have to emphasize
It was a minority of a minority.
But you don't need many to enact that and for
Exactly.
for the threat to have an effect.
Exactly. And these older, mature men were saying, it's time. It will take time. People get passionate about these things, but it'll be over before you know it. Don't provoke them.
But it doesn't just take time, it also takes challenging.
But it's not only that. One of the things that I was very much worried about was you are opening a can of worms, because you're going to say, we're going to let this minority of minorities get away with it, and then others will see an opportunity to say, but wait a second, I can do that too. I can also threaten to use force to get what I want. Or in this case, what we're seeing recently is to cancel people.
Yes.
And character assassinate them. I can get away with all of this. If they're getting away with it, so can I.
Yes.
And why not? You can have society will fall into different groups of people who will rightfully think, if you can have it, why can't I?
And that strikes me as that's the problem that's getting worse and worse. I mean, we had this week in Parliament, Nashar talking about the offence and hurt and emotional harm that cartoons of Muhammad cause, right?
Exactly. And if your emotions, your feelings, your sentiments, your preoccupations deem us, the rest of society, to indulge it, why not someone else's feelings? And then it's all about feelings, and now I just leave the rest to your imagination.
Well, that's impossible to legislate, surely, because everyone has different feelings about different things, and how could you even begin with
We
this?
can't. And this is, I think, why modernity, Western civilization, it was like, we are going to deal with emotions, and we're going to, at the center of the way we do things, we're going to place reason.
Yes.
That's not a denial of emotion. It's not a subjugation of emotion. It is everybody's emotion will have equal rights.
Yes.
And there'll be we are not going to favor this group over that group, and so on. And then we'll try and translate that into law. A daunting effort, but it has happened for a time.
Yes,
and for a time it was successful. And your country, Britain, has started that effort, and it's an ongoing thing. And in the US, up to a point, I think we got somewhere, but now here we come. The emotions are coming out at us again. So my feelings, the way I feel, my right, the way I see my truth, this, that, and the other. And if you do that, then it is subjectivity, then prevails over objectivity, and then
well, society crumbles. I mean, I can't see how it works because, I mean, I get it. I understand that if someone attacks my most cherished beliefs, I get that it hurts. I get that it's not comfortable. But how can I possibly expect the law to protect me from that? I mean, and then you get these words thrown about. I mean, they'll say, well, you've drawn a cartoon mocking our religion, therefore we're going to label you Islamophobic, pathologize, you call you this thing. Maybe they just don't think your God exists. Maybe they think your God is silly, and maybe that's okay. That's.
But the thing is, the reality we were living in 2003 and it was for Christians and Jews and other people who attach, Western religions. They had come to terms with that. Whatever your cherished belief was, that was going to be mocked. I asked the rhetorical question: why is there no life of Muhammad? There's a life of Brian. And I was told, behind closed doors, nobody was going to put their name to this.
Yes.
The Muslims are not that far. In other words, they're not culturally or religiously mature enough to get to a point to allow the mockers to mock. It's not that the people who care about Jesus Christ think, the life of Brian is great.
Yeah.
They don't. They're offended.
No, they're deeply offended.
They're deeply offended, but they've learned to look away. And that ability to look away and let things be is a sign of maturity. And behind closed doors, and this is what the racism of law expectations is about, but those Muslims, they're just not there yet. That's really what it boils down to.
That's a really interesting point as far as is it this expectation that Muslims are likely to react violently if they're upset? That's a very patronizing
because the Christians used to do that in the past. They're over it now.
Right.
They're old enough, they're mature enough, they're adults. But the expectation that a Muslim who expects to be offended.
Yes.
So the assumption is if you're a Muslim, a drawing of the Prophet Muhammad, whether it's flattering or not, is going to offend you. Can you look away?
Well, it's not necessarily true that all Muslims would be offended.
Well, first of all, it's not true.
Yeah.
That's again why I think it's a form of racism, and it's a form of, in itself, if you want to pursue the notion of Islamophobia,
yes.
it is actually a form of phobia. First of all, it's not true. It applies to a minority.
Yes.
But the assumption is they can't deal with it. The Christians can, the Jews can, maybe the Buddhists and the Sikh can.
Yes.
But the Muslims, they can't deal with it. They're just going to erupt in a violent rage, so let's not provoke them. We're not going to make a life of Muhammad.
Did you see the story about Batley Grammar School in the UK
Yes,
recently?
I did, yeah.
And similarly with the anger from the protesters outside about the teacher who had shown the cartoon of Muhammad. And the assumption in the media that, okay, those people represent what it is to be Muslim in the UK. That's not true at all.
It's absolutely not true. And I think there are a lot of Muslims who look at this and they just cringe.
Yeah.
They look at these men with the beards who are foaming at the mouth and who just make a spectacle of themselves.
Yes.
And who say they speak for Islam, and they cringe and they're embarrassed. And at the same time, obviously, they don't want to encourage drawings of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
But they stay silent. These are the people who have been cancelled into silence by the extreme minority who say that they speak for their religion.
Do you
so in that sense, I think the best way would be to just expose this minority foaming at the mouth for exactly what they are.
And do you think the media is complicit in a sense that, you know, if you're going to have a discussion about this, don't invite the imam who's angry and is screaming about how people must be put to death. Don't invite that person, because that's not representative of...
Well, they invite themselves, because they are the ones who then go picketing, they are the ones who go shouting and demonstrating. They threatened the teacher, I believe, they threatened the headmaster.
He went into hiding,
yeah, the headmaster had to apologize and all sorts of things. And so it's that bit, it's the apologizing, it is the why should you apologize? Why not say to these individuals, you do not represent the wider, we don't recognize you as representing anyone other than yourselves.
Yes.
We're not impressed by the way you want to do things. Please step aside, and if you refuse to do that, there'll be, we'll just call the police, or, you'll have to deal with the law. The headmaster should not have apologized. The school teacher should not have gone into hiding. And I think it's these things that empower them.
So again, we come back to this point of convergence. We can all agree that the people who are calling for the death of a school teacher or anything like that are a tiny minority, certainly not representative of Muslim people. Most Muslim people in this country would find that appalling. So we can all agree with that. But then we come back to the problem of the complicity with that minority, is that too many people are saying that they've got a point.
Well, I think if we take this example to then the next step, which is, the teacher had to go into hiding because in France, under similar conditions, a teacher was beheaded.
This is Samuel Paty.
Samuel Paty.
Yes.
And so this is real, right?
It's real, exactly. And it only takes a
one
few.
of those individuals will at some point try and plot the murder of a teacher, and we don't want that to happen. So for that, then, I think, is a key issue for the government of the day, because it's the government's job to protect citizens from other citizens, right, on a domestic level. And so they are the ones who should make sure that that crime doesn't take place.
But the solution to that isn't to blame the victim and say, oh, actually, you shouldn't offend people, therefore. No. The solution surely is to say, actually, if you're going to, if this minority group, a tiny group of people are going to threaten someone's life for showing a cartoon, then we all show the cartoon.
That is how I would do it, because obviously you get into the cost perspective, which is how is the government going to protect this one individual from who knows where the threat might come from? In which case, and I've been saying this from the time threats against me started and others. Yes. Then let's all do it. Let's all say it, so that you find protection in numbers.
You spread the risk.
You spread the risk. Who are they going to kill next?
Yes.
And when you do it that way, the plotting that it's a kind of threat. ISIS when they were in their heyday, were not a threat to one or two individuals. They were a threat to all of us. And there were all sorts of measures that we were taking. But then back then it was, okay, this is the threat. So we're all going to go about our lives. And, if someone if an individual is targeted, then we all say we are all that individual. That would be a cheaper, more balanced way of doing it. And obviously we protect said individual.
Yes. It is so difficult. I mean, during the Charlie Hebdo affair, I understand why an employer of a media outlet wouldn't want to show the cartoon, because it puts his employees or her employees at serious risk. It's not a. But then, by the same token, had all of the media outlets shown the image, which was, let's face it, newsworthy, it was core to the relevance of the story, then, as you say, that would have spread the risk. And that's one way of dealing with it. But how you do that when there's the fear of death in the air is difficult.
I think we've done it with different groups. We've done it with all sorts of organized crime. I think we've done it actually with white supremacists, because skinheads go around all over the place threatening people. And that threat has been understood and mitigated. But it's been made very clear to that particular group, sorry, regardless of what you do, you won't get away with it. The mafia. Various types of people who engage in organized crime, whether it's for ideological reasons or for monetary reasons. Open societies deal with this all the time.
And we have to have a discussion about it.
We have to have. I think where we go wrong is where we give one small group an exception on grounds of religion, where we go so far as what I've been reading about in Scotland, where they're actually going to bring in so-called hate laws, which is just bringing back blasphemy laws. It's just blasphemy laws with a different name, but then exclusively only for Muslims.
Yes, this is something the SNP are pushing forward. So just to, I just want to bring this to a close, because I could talk to you for hours about this. I think it's fascinating. And I think your book does a really great service in opening up this debate. And I do hope that everyone reads it. I think it's very important, particularly those who are trying to just wish away this problem. And I understand why they want to, but I think it has to be confronted. And I think I just want to address one point in your book that you raise, which is that you accuse governments of failing refugees, ultimately, because you're saying that their multicultural policies effectively mean that the refugees cannot flourish in European society and are almost destined to hold fast to those cultural norms that we do not accept. So what can be done? What do we do? Where do we go from here? How do we make these changes that you are saying are so needed?
Let's start with the assumption, what is it that you want refugees to do when they're here? Which is, do you accept them and include them into every aspect of life? Or do you keep them in their own little island? And is the expectation that one day they'll go back to their country and culture of origin? And so really it's just like potted plants. You put a plant in a container and after a while you can take the container and take it back. Or are they going to be a part of us? And if the assumption is, and I am a proponent of total assimilation, let them be a part of our society, a part of everything we do, then include them in everything, including our values, our norms, our customs, the way we do things, written and unwritten. Actually, that's also the best path towards success for them.
Yes.
And so my answer lies in how do we explore ways of doing that? And that then means reordering our assumptions and the way we look at refugees, asylum seekers, immigrants. Are they people whom we think are going to be here temporarily, or do we want them among us forever? And if the latter is the case, then assimilation is the path.
And indeed having the courage to assert that some values are better than other values.
Absolutely, yes. That's why they're here.
Yes.
You see, people are leaving at the risk of losing their lives. South Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and this is, I say this in the book, why they're here because they want to improve their lives.
Yes.
And you get to live longer in peace and hopefully in prosperity. If you come here than if you stayed in Syria or Afghanistan or Somalia or any of those places. So since you made your way here,
yes,
you're welcome.
In other words,
everything.
Give these people what they want. what they've come for.
What they've come for. And they've voted with their feet for the values that we have here and for the civilization that we have here. And if these men come all raw and crude and uncivilized, then let's civilize them and refine them and introduce them to the promises of being friendly to women.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating discussion. Like I say, I wish we could do it. Maybe we can do it again sometime. It would be great.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Andrew. Wonderful talking to you.
And please do buy Ayaan's new book, Pray, Immigration, Islam and the Erosion of Women's Rights. It's a very important piece of work and I would highly recommend it. Thank you very much.